Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Lindsay Calloway, and I'm a researcher with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's Centre for Research on Church and Faith. Today's guest is Dr. Sam Reimer, a professor of sociology at Crandall University in New Brunswick. Rick Heemstra and I will be discussing Sam's new book, Caught in the Current: British and Canadian Evangelicals in an Age of Self-Spirituality. His book explores some of the deep cultural shifts in Western society and their effects on evangelicalism. Stick around after our chat with Sam. Rick and I will discuss our thoughts and observations about the themes in his book.
Congratulations, Sam, on the publication of your most recent book, Caught in the Current. The premise of your book is that evangelicals are being influenced by a cultural undertow, to keep with your current metaphor in the title. And you suggest that this is causing a drift in typical behaviors and beliefs associated with evangelicals. Before we look at some of those beliefs and behaviors more deeply, this idea of a dominant cultural reframing taking place in Western society is a central topic and almost an interpretive key for the findings in your book. Could you briefly describe this cultural force that is shaping the Western world?
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking with a friend recently, and he noted that the idea of caught in the current might just not be a river metaphor. We could interpret current as now. So it's the current cultural zeitgeist. He's much more creative than I am, because I only thought of one possible meaning to the title of the book. But here we go. That could work as well. So when I started this study of evangelicals in Canada and in Britain, I expected to find that the influence of the culture would be quite chaotic, sporadic, idiosyncratic, so that everybody was kind of doing their own thing because of the diversity of the cultural influences. But what I found was that was not the case. And so after interviewing about 125 clergy and laity on both sides of the Atlantic, I concluded that the influence that was shaping them, this broader cultural zeitgeist, as I call this influence, was pushing them all in a similar direction, because there is a dominant cultural narrative that is international in scope in Western society. And I argue in the book that this dominant cultural narrative is best understood as a move from an external locus of authority, which might have been more typical, say, of the silent generation before the boomers. And we're moving now to an internal locus of authority, where an individual is their own spiritual guide. That is, they determine what is right, what is good, how they should live their lives, what they should believe, is based on an inner sense. They follow their heart. Whereas before, with an external locus of authority, the assumption was that external authorities, say parents or religious leaders or politicians or whoever, would guide people, and they would largely defer to what they were told. That's changed. That's, I think, the key to what's changed in our society, is this move toward an internal locus of authority where we are expected to be our own guides. We're expected to find ourselves and to be true to ourselves as we hear in our society.
Sam, you say that understanding this inward or subjective turn is key to understanding not just what is changing in evangelicalism, but why it's changing. But typically, evangelicals value the Bible as this central authority in their lives, and being part of a church community where the Bible is taught and preached and studied, that's part of upholding the centrality of God's word as an external authority. So how does that compute with the trends that you're seeing that relocate authoritative judgments to the self?
Yeah, definitely a concern for the pastors that I talked to pastors in about 65 different churches in Canada and Britain, and they were concerned that they no longer had the influence that maybe pastors or priests had in the past. Particularly, they thought, an hour once every other week or so was not nearly enough to influence kids when they're spending, dozens of hours on the internet. And so they were very concerned that they were losing that influence. People read their Bible much less than they used to, as some of the work from EFC has definitely been showing. And they pray less than they used to. They go to church less often than they used to. And so this influence of external authorities, especially in this case, religious authorities, they just don't have much time to protect children, if you like, or even older people against the larger influence of the culture, this current, as I say in the book.
Now, you also talk about how there's been a bit of a change in the understanding of what belief is. Can you explain what that change is so that we're all working with the same dictionary? How has the concept of belief changed?
Yeah, so in the past, religious belief was largely understood as assent to a creedal proposition. That is, this is what our denomination, our religious group believes, or Christians believe in the Nicene Creed, and this is largely accepted by all Christians. And so we have this stable, long-term deference to this belief. I'm suggesting in the book that this has changed. What we have now is much more of what Abby Day, a sociologist in Britain, argues is a much more relational understanding of belief. That is, we believe things because our close, warm relationships have influenced us to believe those things. And as a result of that, they vary, our beliefs vary based on our relational networks. And they change from different times in our lives. Because what we're doing here is we're actually signaling, argues Day, this allegiance to our mates, to the people around us that we care about. And so in the book, I suggest that what's happening with beliefs is sort of a difference between when we think about when I say, I believe in God, as opposed to when I say, I believe in you. The first, I believe in God, is expected to be true of me for a long period of time, stable belief. And it is a creedal belief that is propositional, and we all hold to it, and there's an intellectual assent to that belief, and it's expected to be true of all Christians. When I say I believe in you, what I really am saying is I'm signaling something about our relationship between me and you, and I'm also suggesting that this is somewhat unique to me, or at least our relational bond. So we're not expecting this to be true of all people at all times, or at least, or even all Christians. This is unique to our relationship. So my sense is that with the inward turn, this move toward an internal locus of authority, we're seeing beliefs that are shaped more by these warm relationships and less by a doctrinal creed.
That's so interesting. And I think we can all maybe anecdotally see this happening in some of our own relationships within the church. How do you think this changes the role of the pastor? What are they going to call people to?
I already suggested that there's this idea of the inward turn, that what I believe is based on my own inner sense, my own heart, where it leads. So it sounds like I'm contradicting myself because I just said, relationship shapes these things. But the truth is, while individuals might believe that they are coming up with their own beliefs out of some sort of inner place inside of them, sort of ex nihilo creating their own beliefs, that never has been true. People are influenced by people around them, and we create our beliefs and our attitudes in dialogue with other people that we care about, people that influence us. So the good news for a pastor or a priest is that they too can be a warm relationship kind of person that influences a youth or an adult in their pews, even if the adult doesn't believe that they are being influenced, that they actually are coming up with their beliefs somehow based on some sort of internal direction.
Sam, historically, a lot of our evangelical denominations were formed by schisms over a particular point of doctrine. And doctrinal beliefs became a very important boundary for our churches. At one point in your book, you say that someone could belong to a church with little concern that one disagrees with official church doctrine. It's this idea that I can be in the church while disagreeing with substantial points of doctrine. How does that work, and how are people reconciling their participation in a congregation where they have these significant disagreements with the teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a little bit confusing because you would think that people would not attend a church that they would have a disagreement with. But if we understand the internal locus of authority, that I am my own guide to matters of belief and practice, what that means is that I can listen to other people, including warm, positive relationships with other people, and have good respect for a preacher or a priest, and still disagree, or at least come to my own conclusions about that. I might accept some, I might accept a lot, but I might disagree with other parts of it. So that's acceptable and doesn't cause a lot of surprising, it seems, that doesn't cause a lot of cognitive dissonance for people in the pews because they're operating on a paradigm that assumes an internal locus of authority. Now, this is a somewhat difficult position for a church leader or even a parent to be involved in because it's harder to have the kind of influence or to pass on the faith, if you like, in the way that they desire. But again, warm relationships do influence, even if the person ultimately senses that they must find their own way. So it gets through, the messages get through. It's just that the church has very little time, if you like, in the total influencers in the person's life to shape those beliefs.
You know, in your conversations with clergy and laity, you said they tended to reframe and qualify their views on more controversial issues to avoid sounding like fundamentalists. And so I was curious, do you see these ironic, gentler framings of objective truths functioning as a slippery slope to the subjective turn, or is this more of an appropriate contextualization in response to a culture that's rapidly changing and shifting away from Christendom?
It's definitely true that this was what I saw among the churches. I attended about 20 different congregations as well, besides talking to 60 plus clergy on this issue. And what I found was that they did try to present, especially controversial issues, in as ironic and gentle as a way as possible. The controversial issues would include exclusive beliefs like Jesus is the only way to heaven and other people are not going to heaven, in fact, might be going to hell. And beliefs particularly about sexuality were the main controversial issues that they faced. So does it make sense to present those in an ironic way? A couple of points on this, and I'll leave it to practitioners who experience this day to day to be guided, as I'm not a day-to-day in the pulpit kind of guy. So on the one hand, I think that Christian clergy should indeed lead with the central important tenets of the faith, and those might not be the controversial issues. Some of them might be, in which case we need to lead with those, but to communicate that a God of great love desires a relationship with you and that this beautiful person named Jesus managed to make a way to let that happen seems to be the right thing to lead with. So in that sense, these controversial issues don't need to be put up front so that they are, as people perceive them to be, the issue of the church, right? We don't want this to be sort of the dominant central tenet that is somehow communicated to society in spite of what is perceived out there. On the other hand, I would say that when clergy don't talk about certain topics, that they are not leaving the person in a neutral place to decide for themselves what they will believe on that topic. In fact, because of the current, society is pulling them powerfully in a certain direction. And so it is not like their lack of speaking on the issue is going to leave the person in a free space to just float around and decide for themselves. The fact is they're probably being carried by a current, and so them speaking in a different way or challenging where that current is taking them actually might balance those things a little more than they might believe. So society is not neutral. I try to be clear about that in the book. And that when we let people decide for themselves, that really is not what's happening. The dominant culture is indeed shaping their values. So clergy should have confidence that what they say could influence them in a positive direction because they're being pulled in maybe the opposite direction.
Sam, what advice would you give to clergy then about how to communicate with people in their congregations? I'll give you an example. I'm not actively working as a pastor right now, but I'm part of a preaching rotation at my local church. And a few years ago, when medical assistance in dying was just coming onto the scene, I referenced it in a sermon and gave what I consider to be an orthodox view that our lives belong to Christ. We've been bought with a price. And I remember that this was probably the sermon that I got the most negative feedback from in my entire life, and, got comments like, keep politics out of the pulpit. And so in a space where, as you say, external locus of authority is increasingly discredited, what's a pastor to do when their voice essentially is discredited?
Yeah, you're quite right that people question external authorities, particularly, it seems, religious external authorities, and that people would question them and their authenticity as a person if they blindly accepted what an external authority, particularly a pastor or a priest, might have to say about what they should believe. So they're not put in a really enviable position to begin with our society. So what's the best way? Well, it strikes me that if I'm correct, that these relational bonds can build influence and that people are shaped by warm relationships with other people. What I'm actually suggesting here is that when people sense that they are guided by their heart, what they are picking up when they sense that this is the right decision based on some sort of internal sense is they're really sensing, I think, has a lot to do with the warm experiences that they have had in other relationships. And so their connection, these past connections with warm relationships, are really what their inner sense is guided by. So that's good news for any authority, any external authority, to remember that if they can lead with convincing a person in the pew that they care about them, that they have their best interests in mind, that they are going to be there when things are going south for the person, then they're seen as authentic and have the chance to become one of these warm relationships that can indeed influence people in important ways. So that is the way I think we should lead. We should lead in this sort of relational way, make a connection, and then be allowed to talk to them about issues that they might find controversial.
So far we've talked a lot about, relating clergy to congregant, and we're talking about maybe people within the fold. And you highlighted how different practices are changing, but I want to bring up evangelism. What stands out to you about how evangelicals are practicing evangelism?
Yeah, this was an interesting part of my research, and it surprised me to a certain degree. Remember, the people I'm talking to here, the lay people I was talking to here, were chosen by their pastors or priests, and they were active in their congregation. So we're starting with we're not just talking about affiliates here, we're talking about people who are pretty active in their faith, a reasonable level of commitment to start. So what I found was among the laity that there was no one who felt that they had the gift of evangelism. And there was only one person that I talked to who had a self-initiated evangelism activity. So this person went out with a thermos of coffee and talked to people in the street. He was heavily involved in street ministry himself. Everybody else, if they did any evangelism, it was attached to the church in some sort of program. So possibly an alpha program or, an outreach like a community barbecue where they would also share the gospel. So this was typical. We're in an environment in Canadian culture and also in Britain where evangelism is really not very popular at all. It is seen as part of a colonial past, particularly among, say, Indigenous people. It is seen as an obstacle to someone finding their own inner path, someone else who, unfortunately is still bound by a sense of deference to an external authority and probably isn't found their authentic self, is trying to foist on me their religious views when they should understand that my beliefs are something that I have to discover myself, especially in an area as subjective as my religious or spiritual views. So not a very popular thing at all. And what we see among Canadian evangelicals is sort of a backing away from overt, at least, evangelism. My friend Joel Thiessen at Ambrose University, sociologist there, argues that the Canadian strategy suggests maybe, the Canadian strategy for evangelism is to be nice and kind of hope someone asks why you're being so nice. And so this very sort of non-in-your-face, non-aggressive, passive, if you like, form of evangelism seems to be the default now, even for evangelicals.
Sam, you asked clergy about Western culture's effect on youth, and there was a common concern about how young people are constantly connected online. And I was wondering if you could sort of explain, how does social media or digital media help move a locus of authority inside? I think that's what you're suggesting.
Yes, it is. And you've done some good work here as well, Rick, on some of your research in Canada. I'm suggesting that the influences that young people receive from our culture are increasingly diverse and multivocal. And so what that requires is that the individual themselves must decide. In other words, what they're getting on social media and what they're getting from their parents and they're getting from the school and from the church might not be the same messages. In fact, they might openly contradict. And so they're left to sort of create their own self out of all these pieces that are being, all these influences that are coming at them from all different directions. This seems to me sort of to be an efficient, if maybe not great, way of forming your own opinions and your own identities even in our society. So I think that's part of the influence. And of course, the internet, as you suggest, Rick, increases the diversity. The voices come from not just a locale, but, can come anywhere in the globe. And the kind of places that you can find information on the internet are really diverse. So it becomes increasingly difficult if we are influenced by those sources to come up with a coherent and stable self. And I think that's one of the dilemmas of the modern self, is that the influences become increasingly multivocal, even though I'm suggesting in the book that there is still this larger core that is shaping people and is common in institutions, including schools. This common core of this move toward an internal locus of authority and general ideas of tolerance, for example, and acceptance of diversity are very strong, but it's pretty minimalist, and it's hard to develop a coherent self just on that amount of data. So it really is up to the individual, they perceive, at least, to create a self that they hope is stable and mentally healthy.
And while the internet is multivocal, as you say, and somewhat chaotic, there are patterns that kind of emerge even in chaos. Even though there are lots of possibilities there, what tends to get presented as the building materials for creating the self, they tend to be managed by algorithms and things on social media. I guess what I'm saying is that what our teens and indeed anyone are consuming, it's not actually that random.
Agreed. Yes, absolutely true. And so these algorithms are socializing our young people in ways that are difficult for the parents to predict. In fact, I think that parents' influences probably continue to decline, as you note in some of your work, Rick, as the command center of their room, where they're getting all these influences online, continues to dominate the influences that shape them. So that is, of course, a concern.
So you mentioned parents, and parents really are an external source of authority, aren't they? And you have a chapter about how parents pass their faith on to their children, which, we're just finishing a research project on this. So it was quite interesting to read. And you mentioned that parents are much less interested in passing on sort of denominational or congregational loyalties. And you sensed that parents didn't want to pressure their children into following their faith. So how do you see this approach to faith formation affecting the next generation of believers? And then I'm even curious, what about practices like paedobaptism? What do you think about the sort of the future of some of the practices that really are about bringing in children into the body of believers?
Yeah, it's difficult. So just going back to what you're referring to in the book, what I was arguing there was a study that was done in the U.S., Christian Smith and his colleagues, thinking about how faith is transmitted from affiliated adults who have affiliation to the children. So it would be true that a lot of evangelical parents are not quite so passive about their interest in passing on the faith as that data suggested, because they're fairly committed to their faith and they do indeed want their children to hold to the orthodox beliefs and practices of the faith. So they are really concerned, often evangelical parents are often really concerned about this faith transmission issue. But it is true that among the population in general, I think in both Canada and the US, and probably in Britain, that a lot of parents are interested in inculcating their kids with good values. And good values can be brought into the kid's life in a variety of ways, one of them being the church. Another one being, say, learning disciplines from a sports team or being involved in a service organizations like the Scouts or whatever else. There could be multiple sources that bring in good values. And so they don't need, they feel, to prioritize church above, say, taking their kids to hockey practice, because that could be another source of good values. And besides, it's good a good family time as well, because we all attend the game together and that sort of thing. So, or going on a hike in the woods, particularly, what the options were during the pandemic, which reordered some people's habits, right? And moved them maybe away from typically going to church on Sunday. So those views of this, let's make sure we just have good values, puts religion sort of as the rumble strips on the side of the road. We're trying to keep the kids out of the ditch, i.e. behaviors that are going to undermine their success or their being nice and kind to other people. And we want to make sure that religion sort of acts as a guidance to keep them on what we would call the straight and narrow. So they do want that, but the particularities of the denominational beliefs or practices are not important to most parents. They see religion as something that can pass on good values and help the kids navigate life. That's the key.
Sam, if I was a denominational leader listening to you talk about a lack of commitment to denominational loyalties and lack of interest in passing on particular denominational commitments, I think I would be kind of alarmed by what you're talking about. It really does put a big question mark around evangelical organization as a group of denominations. And I know you don't cover this in your book per se, but do you think that this points to a reconfiguration of how evangelicals will be structured in the future if denominationalism becomes less important to people through the generations?
Yeah, I do think so. And I do write a little bit about sort of this restructuring process that I see happening now with these increasing number of network churches that aren't officially connected with a denomination, but are more like a movement or a loose coupling between different churches. And the church has really a lot of freedom. It's almost Baptist in polity, right? This very low amount of denominational oversight. And it's really up to, say, an entrepreneurial pastor to lead. But I think we're even seeing it now, Rick, as you know, we're seeing more of this, people changing their names from denominational church to community church or whatever. And so they're trying to downplay people's presuppositions that this denomination has these certain biases or whatever. And so they're trying to be more inviting with this idea of community church or just a generic name about charity or love or something that's going to attract people in. So I think we are seeing declining financial and deferential support to denominations, and denominations are increasingly needing to be light on their feet and be able to demonstrate their value to the church quite clearly, as before, it might have just been taken for granted that the denomination is something that we support as a congregation.
So, Sam, up until this point, a lot of what we've been talking about sounds quite almost alarming for evangelical churches and parents and pastors. What are some of the markers of hope that you see for the evangelical church?
Well, there's several. One of them has clearly got to be immigration, and the fact that you and I, Rick, have done work on this in the past, and we found that the immigrants coming into Canada are slightly more likely to be evangelical than the percentage of evangelicals currently in Canada, and that our immigrants tend to be pretty highly committed, a higher commitment on average than the typical Canadian. So immigrants are, of course, starting evangelical churches across Canada, and they are also revitalizing evangelical churches across Canada. So that is a wonderful thing as we become more ethnically diverse, and they bring new life into a lot of congregations that are declining. We can't forget about the transmission thing. It is still true that evangelicals, based on Hemorrhaging Faith and other reports, are doing better at holding on to their youth than other groups. And so if we have parents who are both in the same pew on Sunday morning and talking about and demonstrating an active faith at home, chances are really good that their children will also follow in the faith. And if they can maintain warm relationships even through those tumultuous teenage years, chances are really good that as young adults, they will also be in a pew like their parents. So that's also good news. And part of the reason for my interest in doing a study on both Britain and Canada was that I think Canada is going to look increasingly like Britain, and we should be taking our cues about where we're going, maybe more from Britain than we are from the US, which is becoming a more unique situation south of the border. If I am right, what's going to happen is that to a certain point, evangelicalism, at least if we ignore immigration, evangelicalism in Canada will continue to decline, partly due to our small family size and other things like that, and our ability to hold on to the kids. Will continue to decline to a certain point, and then you have maybe the remnant or people who are really committed because there's no longer cultural supports for being active in their faith. And in that situation, my guess is that evangelicalism will continue to move to the periphery. But I think if we look historically, and I have to trust other historians because I'm not one on this, evangelicalism maybe works best in the periphery instead of when it's in the halls of power, where it can often succumb to political influences and other influences like that. So that could be good for evangelicalism, to have a committed group of people who are operating in the peripheries to influence a culture for the better.
You know, Sam, I was speaking with a few children's ministry leaders earlier this month, and a lot of them said they have grandparents coming up to them saying, how can I help my grandchildren? How can I help the other children in the church? And I think there's quite a few people from previous generations who've maybe noticed the effects of these cultural shifts that you've noted, and they might not be able to quite put their finger on what is happening or how to help. So do you have a word for them for how they can understand the cultural current and how they can chart a course through it?
Yeah, I'm hoping the term that I use in the book will be helpful there. This notion that people are more and more assuming that they are their own authority and that they need to guide their own beliefs and values. I think it's great that grandparents are interested in being involved in their grandchildren and other youth's lives, because there's lots of evidence that show that the faith transmission is not only about the importance of the parents passing on the faith, but also other warm adult relationships with youth are very significant. So if we have multiple caring adults who are reinforcing what parents are trying to tell kids about their faith, I think there's a much better chance of that sticking. Obviously, youth leaders are important here, pastors are important here, but grandparents and other adults in congregations, uncle so-and-so who's not really an uncle, you have the kind of fictive kin, those kind of relationships are really important for our kids. We can always remember that if we can maintain warm relationships, we will have an influence. And, they're listening to a lot of voices out there, but the voices that they put the most weight in are the ones that demonstrate to them that they really care and that they're on their side for the long haul. So we can increase the few hours a week maybe that our voices are heard by making sure those relationships are significant and salient to the young person themselves.
Sam, thank you so much for being on the Faith Trends podcast to talk about your book, Caught in the Current, British and Canadian Evangelicals at an Age of Self-Spirituality. We will link to where people can find your book in the show notes, but I'm wondering, could you just tell us briefly how people could learn about other research that you've done and perhaps connect with you?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah, definitely encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. I hope it's helpful. I wrote the book, even though it's an academic book and an academic publisher, I wrote the book with the person in the pew and the person in the pulpit in mind. So I deliberately planned for two audiences, not just other researchers like myself, but also the kind of people that I talk to who are very generous in sharing their lives and information with me. Yeah, definitely can send me an email at Crandall University. Be happy to talk to you about some of the other work that I've done. My research tends to be evangelicalism and often comparative, particularly US-Canada comparisons, but now also Britain and Canada comparisons of evangelicalism. But I've written a fair bit about tolerance and I'm working now thinking about religion and ethics, but lots of research sort of in this area of religion in Canada, and very happy to talk to practitioners on the ground about their experience and what they're finding as well. So yeah, send me an email. Happy to talk.
Rick, I'm so glad that Sam wrote this book, because somebody approached me earlier and said, how can I learn more about this idea of what's happening in culture without having to read, the 800-page tome that Charles Taylor wrote on the authentic self called A Secular Age. Now I can point them to this book, because I think Sam lays out very clearly and then can illustrate how this subjective inward turn is playing out not only in our culture but within evangelicalism. And so I think this is just going to be a great resource.
I think Sam does such a good job with this, and he really unpacks how this is affecting evangelicals. Sometimes we like to think that there's the culture out there and that we are back here defending the faith and that it doesn't affect us. But I think that Sam shows so convincingly how this is influencing our churches. And it's not that I think pastors don't feel this or know this, but sometimes it's helpful to have a skilled researcher like Sam come along and really describe it and give it shape so that it crystallizes in your mind the task that we have, even to help our people stay connected to, I don't want to really use the word authentic, but an authentic Christian evangelical faith.
I think maybe one of the concerns I have is so much of the solutions that he was presenting was to maintain these warm relationships with people. And I think that's great. I worry that pastors are going to see themselves as the one who has to forge this warm relationship with everybody in the pew. And so I wonder how moving forward this can be seen as something that is shared among the leadership or people in the church, that forging and connecting these warm relationships, it can't just be the pastor.
Yeah, I think that's important. I just got finished speaking at a conference with Bruce Clemenger, and one of the things Bruce Clemenger says about religious freedom is that part of our role in terms of religious freedom is helping our neighbors understand what they believe, because Bruce says that you can't choose either to embrace the beliefs or reject them if you don't understand what you believe. And I think that in the same way, we have a task in the evangelical church to help people, our own people, understand what they believe. And what I'm talking about here is not the creeds, it's not our doctrinal statements, but it's the way in which the culture may have influenced me. For instance, when we say, I don't know what I want to do when I get out of high school, there's an anthropology in there of two me's, right? There's the me that doesn't know what me wants to do. And this is the authentic self. This is what Sam is writing about that's coming up here. And sometimes we don't realize that. We've created a world in which we're elevating the authentic self to be what should be guiding us, instead of, for instance, in this case, saying to our kids, what is God calling you to be? What is God calling you to do in your life? And then God becomes that external authority calling us to our life's work. And so I think that there's a need for us to help people to understand the ways in which this cultural current has shaped ourselves, so that we have the capacity to reorient ourselves back to a more biblical understanding of our faith, and to be able to say, as the Lord's Prayer does, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, not my kingdom come, my will be done in my life as it is in everyone else's life, right? It's thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.